The disconnect of our political elites from just regular people oftentimes produces terrible government policy that really hurts all of us. Let's talk about that. Thank you for watching. My name is Glen Morgan, and this is We the Govern. So as always, just to give you a quick trigger warning in case you only want to hear things that have been approved by Governor Inslee's Ministry of COVID Compliance, you should stop watching right now. However, if you want to watch what they will not approve, what they have not approved that I'm going to say, you can continue watching, and you've been forewarned. So I want to quickly go into the basic topic that we introed earlier, which is just this disconnect of the political elites. And when I say political elites, I'm referring to not just the politicians, but also to the bureaucrats and the grant grifters and the people who use their wealth and finances to influence government and create public policy that benefits kind of an incestuous group of people, and rarely does it actually have the positive impact that it's oftentimes sold to the rest of us as. And this disconnect from regular people, I think, is something that's increasing more and more and producing terrible government policy. And what really made me think about this recently is I was up north in King County. I live in South Thurston County right now. King County is where I grew up, and I happened to be up there. I had a little bit extra time, and it had been years since I had driven by this restaurant, and I stopped and I wanted to take a couple photos here. It's on 260th and Pacific Highway, and it's called Pleasant Garden Restaurant. It was a Chinese restaurant, and I took a couple photos when I stopped there just a few days ago. And the reason why I stopped there is that this was actually one of my first real jobs that I had when I got a driver's license. I had, before that, I had worked in a cabinet shop. I had done a lot of yard work for a lot of people. I was a paper boy for the Seattle Times. I'm sorry, I probably distributed lots of terrible propaganda to hundreds of people for a long time, but I was a pretty good paper boy, and that was one of my jobs. But I had a driver's license now, so I could drive up to Pleasant Gardens Restaurant and get my first real job there, which was as a dishwasher. And to me, this was a big deal. My cousins actually worked there at the time. I was very excited to get this dishwashing job. And eventually I moved on up to busboy. And busboy was quite a step up because you could take and share just a small percentage of the tips that the waitresses got, and they would share it with us. And that was very exciting. And you could go out, and if you did a really good job, they might give you a couple dollars more. And that seemed like a really exciting job to me at the time. And I was very happy to have it because, after all, the only way I was going to keep my car in gas and to have enough money to actually do the stuff I want to do on the weekends, like going to running races or going kayaking or hiking or camping or hunting or whatever it was I was doing, I needed to make money, and this was the place that gave me that opportunity to do it. So for me, I was just very happy about working there, and it was just kind of fun to run by and see if this restaurant was still around. It had been several decades since I'd even driven by this area, so it was just fun to see it again. And it made me think when I was there, how many of our political elite ever had experiences like that or jobs like that when they were that age? Or can they even relate to people who have those types of jobs? I have Congressman Adam Smith here and Kim Schreier, and then also Governor Inslee, just as images of people who are regularly making decisions that impact your life and mine and regular people in our communities. And yet, these decisions oftentimes seem totally disconnected from the reality that regular people are having to deal with. And so, do these people even have life experiences that are even close? Or do they even care? Do they even have the ability to relate to anybody that is in these positions in anything other than a paternalistic, I know better than you kind of attitude? Kind of that savior complex that oftentimes permeates big government at all levels. And the answer to that, I think, is oftentimes no, because I know when I have doorbelled and many thousands of people, and sometimes the Governor Inslee will come up, and I want to talk to people about him whenever I'm out in the community. And these are the words that I can actually print here that are not illegal, so they're not profanity, just words that refer to our governor and how regular people would view him. And being disconnected and out of touch, arrogant, corrupted, and elitist, these are oftentimes words that are used in reference to Governor Inslee, especially when it comes to his mandates or his mask policies or tax policy or soft on crime policies, whatever it might be. These are the types of words that I hear referring to the governor. Again, there are oftentimes a lot of worse words, but these are the ones that I would hear from people who are maybe a little less emotional. And that's not a good thing. If you have a representative government, in theory that you're electing these people to come in and represent you as the citizens, then there should be a better connection between the elected officials and the regular person on the street and who are basically working at Pleasant Gardens, and they're washing those dishes or they're doing something else like that. And no area does this really show up more for me when I'm talking to people, especially recently, than the area of crime. When it comes to this rapid escalation of crime that's occurred all throughout the Puget Sound area and really throughout Washington state, and it's because the elite people like Governor Inslee and these congressmen or many of our senior bureaucrats, they're never going to have their house broken into. They have paid security. They got fancy alarm systems. They live in nicer areas. They don't have to deal with the plague of crime. They're probably not having to deal with people stealing their cars or having their cars broken into. These are the regular crimes that occur. If you've ever doorbelled an apartment complex, you talk to people what they're frustrated about. They're very frustrated, and rightly so, of having all their stuff stolen from their car damaged. It's a big deal to them. And to me and to you, it's a big deal to us. It isn't a big deal to the elite because this type of thing doesn't really happen to them. Even worse yet is the increasing tragedy that's occurring throughout our communities, not just the escalating murder rate in Seattle, but also in Kent and these other cities, Tukwila and places around it, as more violent crime does start to seep out. It may not be quite at the Portland level where they set a new murder record recently, but it is increasing very dramatically and much higher than it's been before. This is affecting regular people. It isn't affecting at all the political elite. The political elite in these little situations, they live in enclaves of fancy, nice neighborhoods with security, great security systems, sometimes armed security guards. They don't have to worry about this, but the rest of us do. And that's why the policies that they tend to push are a real problem for us. Now, there are crimes that these elected officials and the elite that surround them are very familiar with. It's usually having to do with kicking money back and forth to others, and sometimes it's not even illegal. It may be totally immoral, it may be dishonest, but oftentimes they've gamed that system so that most of this is actually legal. But some of it could be illegal, and it would be hard because if you're an elected official or you're one of these bureaucrats, you're really used to people kicking you cash to make and help and influence decisions. Well, actually what I really mean is piles of cash, kind of like that, stacks of cash. Or to be more realistic, in Washington state, it's a room full of cash. And we're talking lots of money that gets shoveled around into all these different policies and different programs and different elitist agendas that really do nothing to benefit the regular people and seem to be totally disconnected. Most of them actually hurt people in the excuse of whether it's climate change or whether it's the diversity, inclusion, or equity agenda. That's the DIE agenda that you oftentimes hear pushed. And whatever these boutique kind of special interest pushes of these agendas, these affect real people. And when you have escalating crime, people like Governor Inslee doesn't care because he's sitting in a room full of cash, guaranteed money that's just flowing into him all the time for whatever the decisions and the way he manipulates the budget and makes sure that billions of dollars go and disappear, not just into Nigerian fraud schemes, but in his friends' pockets and other grant grifting operations that occur. And this is why you'll also see these very elite left-leaning, mostly, people push things like defund the police and gun control. And when you look at the people who actually write the checks to support gun control, for example, that locally is oftentimes Bill Gates or Nick Hanna, these are billionaires that live in the Washington state area. Steve Ballmer joins them as well. And also George Soros and other billionaires from around the country, Bloomberg, for example. These guys are pushing for gun control because after defunding the police, when you're not going to be safe any longer, they figure, well, let's take away your guns so that you can't defend yourself either. And this is just, again, an extreme elitist attitude. All these guys that are pushing for this type of regulation, they have armed security guards. They don't have to worry. They don't need to have a gun personally because they pay the guys to carry the guns around them. So it's only low income and middle income, regular people who need to have guns for their own protection. That's what they don't want. And that's what they end up spending all their money and their focus on is pushing these policies that only hurt regular people. That's it. They hurt regular people. They don't hurt them. It hurts the rest of us. And this is an extreme disconnect. There's nothing good about that. That's a really negative thing in a society that you're electing people to represent you. Let's talk about inflation. Inflation's the other thing that affected more at a federal level, but you see it affected with other state policies that also destroy the value of the dollar because you're taking away, with taxes and regulations, you're taking away the ability of people to spend more of their own money. And so the elite don't really care. Inflation doesn't affect them. They can invest. I mean, it affects them a little bit, but it doesn't affect them that much because they can invest in certain types of assets that adjust for inflation. If you even if you work as a senior level bureaucrat, you're oftentimes paid in a way that your income is always adjusted with the cost of inflation, and that is not something that regular people are able to experience. And I want to use this one example that I had just kind of growing up, because it does affect, inflation will affect the rest of us. This is a picture of me when I was younger with my dad in the 1970s outside of our house in what is now Newcastle. It was rural King County at the time, on our farm. And this was a house that my dad was building. My dad and my mom were very focused on getting this house built. And they told me that when I was talking to him many years later, that the escalating cost and increasing cost of material, because of inflation, it was going up so much. The original budget for the house had nothing to do with what the final budget looked like it was going to be, because they were building the house themselves. They weren't paying a contractor to do it. They were pouring their own concrete. They were putting up their own wood. They were putting up their own roofing. We went to the mill to cut the beams out for the house. We were building it all ourselves. And eventually we had to move in just for financial reasons. They had to move into this house. And when we did, we didn't have money for the windows because that money had been spent buying the other material just to get the roof on and the walls up. And so what we did is we put visqueen over the windows. It's plastic covering, kind of like a drop cloth covering that you would use if you were painting. And we used clear visqueen. I kind of remember this as a kid. I'm not saying that like, woe's me. It was, I don't even think as a kid I cared. It was just that was what they had to do for us to move in. Now, eventually, they were able to save up enough money they could pay for the windows. They replaced the piece of plywood that just slid back and forth for the front door. The hay eventually came out of the upstairs. We didn't have to use the hay loft anymore, and we could eventually finish it as a house. But what really caused the stress at that time was this increasing inflation, cost of fuel, cost of goods. It was really increasing quite a bit. And there are government policies that are implemented that oftentimes, right now, we're seeing it all over the country, jacking up the amount of money that government spends and wastes money, and they squander money in all kinds of esoteric dreams and plans, kickback schemes, whatever it is, and it's devaluing the dollar. And so what you have is this increasing inflation that's occurring. That affects regular people. That doesn't affect the elite, and that's a significant disconnect. Now let me talk about the final disconnect, and I really want to bring this in because I think that this is it's a good way to finish this discussion because it has to do with secondary education. Despite growing up the way I did, which was probably fairly unusual, I did end up going to Columbia University on the East Coast. It's an Ivy League school in the middle of New York City. I do have to admit that when I was first contacted by them, I didn't even know what the school was, and I had to look it up in U.S. News and World Report because my counselor at Thomas Jefferson High School in Federal Way hadn't heard of it either. So I didn't get much help from public school, and I had to do most of the work myself to actually get in there. However, when I went there, I really did learn quite a bit because in places like this, these are the institutions that are basically incubating the future political leadership, the people who tend to run the government. A lot of people that I graduated with here are the people who went to run government in D.C., or they go and run government in their various states. Same with a lot of the other Ivy League colleges and these elite schools around the country. The problem with that is when you actually go to school with some of these people, it's terrifying to imagine that those are the people actually in the decision points in these countries, because it doesn't mean that they're not smart. They're oftentimes pretty intelligent people, but they have no attachment to the real world. There were only a few kids I went to school with there who actually had done any kind of manual labor or work ever in their life. That idea was very much a disconnect for them. And I, of course, had to work the entire time I was in school, whether it was working in the gym or getting a paper shuffling job at a law firm or doing whatever I could to hustle and get extra money. And the summers, I remember driving trucks and building cabinets, doing whatever I could just to make enough money to keep coming back to school. And the disconnect between people who are actually trying to have more connection, I think, to the real world and those who have kind of this very elitist, total lack of understanding as to what it's like to live in the real world is a problem. And yet these are the people who tend to be running government. Just to give you an update on that, recently this year, a North Korean defector who actually went to Columbia University, so my alma mater, reminded everybody and made news after she graduated saying that it was more oppressive there than it was in North Korea where she escaped, and that they were trying to change the way she was thinking or trying to stifle free speech and trying to really control her and have an exceptional groupthink mentality, which I experienced when I was there, not quite as bad as probably she had it by the time she went there a few years ago. But this is not a good indication. This is not a place that you want to grow your political elite, the people who are here to supposedly represent those of us in government and to make the decisions that affect the rest of us. This lack of disconnect and the groupthink mentality that tends to come with it, and that elitist attitude is almost certain to produce policy that's going to be a disaster and a problem for everyone else. And that isn't what any of us want. But unfortunately, that's who we have in charge right now. And their attitude is oftentimes that they know how to run our life better than we do. And this is something that we have to confront and recognize head on. We have oftentimes put some of the worst people in our country in charge of government or in charge of the policies that surround government. And whether they be grifters, whether they just be super wealthy, disconnected people, sometimes they might mean well, sometimes they don't. But regardless of that, there's always a human nature element involved in this. If they are totally disconnected, the decisions they make will not be good for any of us. It's one of the reasons why those of us who care about freedom and liberty, we don't want people like this in charge of government. And that's why we want government to have a lot less of an ability to hurt and impact and damage our lives. Because if government is much smaller, then people have a lot more control over their own lives. We'd rather these people just left us alone. We don't think they can run our lives better than they can. I mean, we think we can run it much better than they think they can. And that's one of the problems that we run into. And that's where you really have a big disconnect, I think, that occurs. And that's why activism is so important. Because unless we expose the truth, unless we're willing to confront them, unless we're willing to be the ones to go and make an impact, we can't make too much of a difference. So it starts with you. Now, you and I and our neighbors and whoever else we can inspire. I'm going to encourage you, if you want to learn more, go to wethegovern.com. Also, please don't forget to subscribe and share this video with others. And I encourage you, as always, to be engaged and involved and show up, because the future belongs to those who show up.